So this is the second part of my video series critiquing Greg Koukl's video, Here's How to Converse with Militant Atheists. So in this clip, we're now going to look at what he says about the problem of evil. So he's talked with the caller who wants to convert his atheist friends to Christianity. This caller's really excited in Christian apologetics, is just getting into it. And he's pointed out that one of the big problems or objections his friends as atheists raise to Christianity is the problem of evil. So Koukl begins by talking with him about getting his friends to recognize that the problem of evil is an objective problem. So when there are, as Koukl says, things like school shootings or rapes or genocides, that these are objectively evil things. And the caller agrees, yeah, he can get his friends to believe that or whatever. So then Koukl says, okay, once you do that, you can then show that, in fact, the problem of evil is not a problem for Christians at all, but rather is a problem for atheists. And we're now joining the video at 6 minutes and 22 seconds in, where he begins to make the point that it's, in fact, a problem for atheists.
Clarified that they believe in objective evil. Those things are actually bad. Okay, fine. So you're an atheist, right? Let's just, yeah. So notice I'm role playing here. I'm role playing both sides for the sake of time.
Yep.
So you're an atheist. Yeah, right. So let's just say there is no God. Okay. Are those evil things still happening? All this stuff you just described, all these school shootings and the genocide and all these rapes and all that stuff, it still happens, right? Yeah. Okay. So there's no God, but all these evil things are happening. Explain to me how those things can be evil if there is no God. That's the question. Explain to me how those things can be evil in the way you're talking about them if there is no God. Now, they might say, wait, I don't get what you're after. Well, okay, wait a minute. You said these things are evil, right? Yeah. That means they broke a rule. They shouldn't have done what they did. There's some rule of goodness that they didn't abide by. They broke a law. That's what it means to be evil, right? Yes. Okay, so you're an atheist. Tell me where those laws come from. I'm trying to make sense of your worldview. Now, notice.
Yeah, I want to just talk a few things about what I think is problematic with Koukl's approach to the problem of evil. So um, first of all, I would say this, that the that the way that he's not seriously engaging the problem to begin with. If you want to have a serious conversation with other people, you don't want to have some quick parry, some rhetorical strategy to try to avoid a problem and turn it back on the other person. What I find is really compelling is when people steelman the objections against their own view and are honest about those objections. Now, I'm not claiming Koukl's being dishonest. Perhaps he really thinks all the things he's saying here are true. But I do think that what he is doing is fundamentally misrepresenting the nature of the problem and how serious it is for Christians. First thing, then, from there, I would say is that you can set aside the whole conversation about evil as such and simply reframe the problem in terms of suffering. Whether or not you believe objective evil exists, it's clear that objective suffering exists, that people and other sentient life forms really do suffer. And yet the Christian believes that God is a maximally good, loving, and all-powerful God, which raises some fundamental questions. Why is there so much suffering in the world if God is a maximally loving and good God? Now, of course, a Christian might say, in terms of a theodicy or a response to the problem of suffering, well, God has morally sufficient reasons to allow every instance of suffering that occurs. And you could argue that, but to think that that's going to be an automatically compelling or even plausible response to the problem of evil is far from obvious. You still have a lot of work to do. If you want to say, well, every instance of suffering in the Holocaust forever, for example, or every instance of a person drowning in the 2004 Boxing Day or December 26th tsunami that drowned 226,000 people in the Indian Ocean, of suffering in all of those circumstances was reasons to allow that. You can argue that, but I think a person could be rightly skeptical that every ounce and modicum of suffering is explained in that way with respect to a perfect God. Conversely, counterfactually, a person could ask, could God not have achieved all the good that he wanted to in the world without having the suffering of 226,000 people drown in the Indian Ocean and having 6 million Jews killed in the final solution? And those are really good questions, I think, that every Christian apologist has to honestly struggle with and seek to answer. And a quick deflection from the problem of evil, or a parry, as Koukl describes it in this video, I think is borders on intellectually disingenuous, but certainly is just a false and not a serious engagement with the nature of the problem. The second thing I would want to say is that in terms of the existence of objective evil, I think that Koukl makes a fundamental blunder here. He conflates two different things: the existence of objective moral goodness and the existence of objective moral obligation. When he talks about laws, because of course he talks about what we have to explain the existence of in terms of rules and laws. What he's actually talking about there is moral obligation, the obligation to do one thing rather than another thing. But he initially was talking not about moral obligation, right and wrong. Rather, he was talking about objective good and evil, uh, which is something different. So, good and evil is something different from right and wrong. Now, presumably, you should follow moral obligations with respect to good and evil, um, and in other words, do right and avoid doing wrong. But there are different meta-ethical accounts for the existence and origin and nature of moral obligation over against moral value, objective moral value, good and evil. And he simply conflates the two in his response by saying you have to explain moral obligation. In fact, a person doesn't have to explain moral obligation necessarily. They could have an account of moral goodness, moral good and evil, without having an explanation of right and wrong, the nature of right and wrong. And there are many atheists, for example, most atheist most atheist moral philosophers, I should say, are objective, have objective views about morality. As I recall, that's the results from David Chalmers' Philosopher's Survey. Uh, and so they believe objective moral good and evil exists, but that it's not addressed adequately with God. In fact, some of these objections go back to the Euthyphro objection, which goes back to ancient Greece. It's a 2,400-year-old problem, at least, which argues you cannot ground the existence of good and evil or right and wrong in the nature of a personal deity. It just has to exist as on its own independently. And so you have, for example, Platonic non-theistic accounts of objective good and evil. And a contemporary philosopher who defends those kinds of objective accounts is Eric Wielenberg. So someone like Eric Wielenberg could say, look, I recognize there's good and evil in the world objectively. I just don't think you can adequately explain it through God. And if Koukl wants to have a serious engagement with this issue, he needs not only to explain why there's so much suffering in the world, he also needs to counteract and provide rebuttals to atheistic accounts of moral good and evil objectively. You can't just deny them or ignore them. You actually have to critically engage them. And then finally, you do have to come to different accounts of moral obligation. Now, when Koukl says, well, for something to be good is just for it to follow a law or a rule, I would say this is not this is not a sophisticated engagement with moral theories about the nature of moral obligation, because rules and laws, those are metaphors or analogies for objective moral obligation. They're not necessarily uh, themselves first level theoretical accounts of the nature of what a moral obligation is. Rather, it's comparing a moral obligation to something from human organization or society, such as a rule or a law. So we still need to have an account, both from the theist and the atheist or non-theist, of the nature of moral obligations. To conclude, I don't think that Koukl has provided a very helpful or sophisticated response to the atheist. But what most concerns me here is this whole approach really shuts down critical reflection within the Christian about the nature of the problem of evil for the Christian. Again, this is a serious problem, and you can reframe it, as I said, away from evil, if you like, simply in terms of the problem of suffering. Why is there so much suffering in the world? And It's one thing to talk about the suffering in the abstract as a let's say the way that a utilitarian says, well, there are hedons or units of pleasure in the world, and there are dolors or units of displeasure in the world. And why are there so many dolors or units of displeasure? And that's a very abstract way of talking about the problem of suffering. But another way to talk about the problem of suffering, is to ask, why did 226,000 people drown in the tsunami? Why did 6 million Jews die in the concentration camps in the Holocaust? Why does one child, a 5-year-old child, slowly suffer agonizing pain and then die from cancer? I mean, these are huge questions. They're questions that are not only intellectual in nature, they're also existential in nature. They're visceral. And if you, as a Christian apologist, do not experience the visceral, daunting nature of these kinds of existential problems of suffering in the world that the Christian has to explain, then I don't think you're yet in a place to seriously engage with the problem of evil. But I will say this as well, that if you do move in out of the shallow end of the pool and into the deep end of the problem of suffering in the world, and you really experience existentially the nature and depth of this problem for the Christian, that will make you a far better Christian apologist when trying to have a discussion with an atheist, because you will understand the problem at least as well, if not even better, than the atheist understands it. And you can be honest about the things that you wrestle with and the questions you still have. And that will give you something which is invaluable when it comes to apologetic dialogue, and that is credibility. You'll show this other person that you want to have this conversation with that you are credible, that you're not simply looking for some quick, easy way to provide a deflection or a parry, or to tie up the problem of evil in a bow, or to turn it back on the atheist in some kind of judo move, but rather that you really are willing to enter into the depth of the problem with critical honesty, self-reflection, and existential vulnerability. And that will do wonders for your witness as a Christian apologist, even if you don't have all the answers.